Okay, Stranger of Paradise Final Fantasy Origin does sound interesting to me. I've played a lot of Final Fantasy games since I was a kid. I do enjoy a lot of them, and this one being developed by Team Ninja with apparently Neo inspired combat gameplay, but with more of the Final Fantasy job systems. Seems like it really could be interesting. Maybe, we'll see. But let's talk the system requirements, because, this doesn't make any sense. Okay? Let's take a look here. Now, first of all, where am I getting this from? This was tweeted out by the Stranger of Paradise Final Fantasy Origin Twitter. And so I've got this image here. And okay, so first of all, they state that the recommended is for 60 FPS at 1920 by 1080. So we got 1080p, recommended, interesting. And they don't specify what the minimum is. By the way, they also don't specify what graphic settings this is. But wait, first of all, some bad news. This is an Epic Game Store exclusive, at least temporarily on PC. It wouldn't surprise me if we eventually see it come to Steam after, 6 months, a year. I don't have any details on that, but that wouldn't be surprising. But here's the thing. If you go to the Epic Game Store page, they do list what the minimum is targeting. And they say 30 FPS at 720p. Whereas the recommended is targeting 60 FPS at 1080p. And I'll tell you right now, this doesn't make any sense. I do not think the minimums are targeting 30 FPS at 720p. If the recommended is really able to hit 60 FPS at 1080p. So I would say that maybe this chart not listing that minimum is actually more correct than what got put on the Epic Game Store page. So that's the first thing I'm going to jump in with. Now, why do I think that? Well, it's based on the recommended GPUs. But first, let's get some of the quick stuff out of the way. The game takes 80 gigabytes of storage. They don't specify that you need to have an SSD or anything. But again, please get SSDs, guys, if you don't have one. Really? Anyway. And they are mentioning DX9 here, so you need at least DX9 compatibility. I'm not sure if that means the game is DX9, or hopefully would maybe have a newer version as well. Compatibility, we'll see. And 8 gigabytes of RAM minimum, 16 gigabytes recommended. That's pretty much the norm these days. Now, the minimum GPUs are the GTX 1066 gigabyte and the Radeon RX 470. Already, that's a little bit strange because usually it's the RX 480 that's kind of on the same performance tier as the 1066 gigabyte, not the 470. And then jumping up to the recommended GPUs, we're seeing the GTX 1660 Super from NVIDIA up against the Radeon RX 5700 XT, which once again are not usually on the same performance tier, but this time it's flip-flopped, with the AMD GPU actually usually significantly outperforming the NVIDIA counterpart. Let me show you here. So this is Tech Power Up, and they have a very good relative performance chart where they take all of their GPU benchmark data when they do reviews, and then kind of stack it all up here as relative performance. Now, this is not perfect, but it is pretty good. It gets you a very accurate ballpark, even if in certain games, some GPUs will outperform others and all of that. Anyway, so first thing I was mentioning is the GTX 1066 gigabytes is generally on par with the RX 480, right? They're listing these as basically equal. Whereas it's the RX 470 that the game is listing as that same performance tier on the minimum spec. So that is a fairly sizable difference, although they're not completely out of the world difference. Now, if you're interested where your GPU stands in comparison to these, well, if you got like a GTX 970, you're kind of in the same ballpark. You're kind of in between the 470 and the 1060. As you scroll up this list, if you see yourself on this list, right, you're seeing the percent of the GTX 1060's performance, so you're falling below that minimum, which if it really is 720p 30 FPS, you're done for. But I really don't think that's correct. Again, based on the recommendation, being able to get 60 FPS at 1080p, which let's go ahead and scroll up. So as you get more powerful than the 1066 gigabyte, now we're seeing cards like the 5500 XT, 6500 XT as roughly equivalent performance, your 1650 Super as, roughly equivalent performance, your 1660 is, a little bit better. Your 1660 Super is now your recommended GPU. Remember, recommended for 1080p 60 frames per second, and it's only about 32% faster than their minimum GPU, which according to the Epic Games page was 720p 30 FPS, and that's why I'm saying this doesn't make any sense. To jump from 30 FPS to 60 FPS is a 100% performance increase. And to go from 720p to 1080p requires an additional performance increase. There's no way that a 30% performance difference between the minimum GPU and the recommended GPU on the NVIDIA side makes any sense at all for that kind of a performance jump. However, if we look at the AMD GPUs, so if we compare the RX 470 as our baseline, which, by the way, is a 4 gigabyte card, at least that seems to be the default option here. So if you have less than 6 gigabytes, all signs point to the RX 470 seems to be recommended here for the minimum recommendation at least. And anyway, so that's a good sign if you're worried about that 6 gigabyte on the 1060. But anyway, if we scroll up here, right? So we're seeing cards and they're percent more powerful, right? So here's your 1660 Super, which is a 58% jump there, which still wouldn't explain a jump all the way from 30 to 60 and from 720p to 1080p. However, again, as we scroll up now, we've got more powerful cards, more powerful cards. Remember they recommended the 5700 or 5700 XT? Let me double check. No, it is the XT version. 5700 XT was the recommended AMD GPU. That is an overdoubling of the performance. That could explain jumping from 720p 30 FPS to 1080p 60 FPS. But the 5700 XT is just out of the league from the 1660 Super. This is what I'm saying about these not making sense being paired up together at all. Except I have one other idea why they might, I guess. But anyway, so what was I doing here? So if we set the 1660 Super as the baseline, usually the 5700 XT is 43% more powerful. I have an alarm going off, but we shoot videos in one take, and I'm just gonna leave that in the video, guys. Anyway, I'm just saying that's such a huge performance difference. This just really isn't making a lot of sense. So, I don't know. I guess what I would assume is going on here is that they were correct on this chart that got tweeted out to not say 720p 30 FPS. And I would just say that, your 1660 Super should be a nice 60 FPS 1080p. And if you're below that, you might be dropping below 60, you might be dropping below 1080p to maintain 60, but they're also not talking graphics settings. Now that could mean a couple of things. It could just mean there's not a lot of graphics settings to tweak. For example, in Final Fantasy VII Remake that we just got the PC version of, there really wasn't many graphic settings to change, and the main thing that they had was dynamic resolution scaling. So maybe that would also be the case in this game. I really don't know. That's a question mark. Now, the last thing that we should probably talk about is the CPUs. And this is another thing where the CPUs don't really make a lot of sense to me in terms of what they're pairing up together. It makes a little sense in that the minimums are 4-core 8-thread, and the recommended are 6-core 12-thread, but the actual performance of the CPU itself in gaming, the Intel ones should be actually significantly outperforming these AMD CPUs due to just having better, instructions per cycle when it was this generation of Intel and AMD. Let me pull up some of the specs just to show you real quick here. So the minimum AMD CPU they said here was the Ryzen 5 1400, which again is 4-core 8-thread. I was correct about that and came out in 2017. The Intel CPU is the Core i7-6700, which is also 4-core 8-thread. Came out in 2015, so it's older, but again, back at that time, Intel had a significant gaming performance lead because of their better IPC on these, better single-core performance. So even if they have the same number of cores, Intel would do a little better. Now, this is a bit older, so that helps the AMD one a little bit here, but when we jump up to the Ryzen 5 1600, we're now talking 6-core 12-thread, again from 2017. But compared to the i7 8700, also 6-core 12-thread, but again, this is a newer chip now. This is actually newer than the Ryzen 5 1600, and it's going to be significantly outperforming that in gaming. If you pull up, like, this is the Tom's Hardware CPU tier list based on their gaming performance reviews, and there's a big tier list here. They don't have everything, but they have a lot. The 8700, you have to scroll down quite a ways to find the 1600 AMD chip, let alone the 1400. So they don't have the 1600, they have the 1600X. The 1600X is actually a little bit more powerful than the 1600. But you can see that we had to scroll down quite a ways on the list. So I'm just saying that there's a lot about this that doesn't make sense to me. Maybe they just only had a few models on hand to test thoroughly, and they're just like, yeah, we can recommend these because we have them, not because they offer equivalent performance. Anyway, that's about all I have to say about this, other than I might get this and benchmark it. We shall see. Let me know in the comment section if you're interested. I have a GTX 1066 gigabyte, so I could test out the minimum and see how it does. So I am pretty tempted to do that. I probably will. I also have some higher end cards with the 3080 and the 6800 XT from AMD. Maybe see how they do at 4K in this game. And then I do have the RX 6600 from AMD, so more of a mid-range, kind of, closer to this ballpark, although kind of, again, between those. And then I'm actually, I think I might be grabbing a 3060 here because the prices came down on them a bit. Don't know if I'd have them in time for this game, which, by the way, I believe is launching. I pulled up an article here. I think it's launching on the 18th. Was that it? Maybe it was in their tweet. Yes, March 18th. And again, Epic Game Store for now. I hope all of you have an excellent day.